Welcome back. In this video, we'd like to add a mesh to our drone blueprint. Notice that at the top left, we have a components panel. So one of the things that the actor class is capable of is having components. And as we add components, we'll see them here in the components panel. Now I'm going to switch on over to the viewport so that we can see anything that we add to this actor class. And we're going to start adding components to this actor. Now we have a couple things here in the components panel. The topmost item is BP drone self. If we select that, then our details panel populates with information about this actor, as the details panel is context sensitive. Now under BP drone self, we actually have a component. We can select that and see details pertaining to that component. Now, every time we create a new actor, by default, it gets a component. And similarly to how there are different types of blueprints, there are different types of components. We can hover over default scene root, and the pop-up tells us that this is the default scene root component. So all actors have to have at least one component, and that one required component is called the root component. The default scene root is a type of component called a scene component, and scene components are relatively basic. You can't see them, they're invisible, but we can add more components in addition to the root component if we like. Now, whatever we have selected in the components panel determines what our new component will be attached to once we add one. And we add one with the Add button. Let's click on that and add a new component. Now we can see the different types of components here, and we can also search for types of components. And the type of component I'd like to add is a static mesh component. If I search for static, I can see that static mesh is an option, and I can add that. Now before I do, I'm going to clear that search bar and click off of that search to show you that I have the default scene root selected as I'm doing this. So when I add a component, it will be attached to the default scene root. Let's see what that looks like by clicking Add and adding a static mesh component. Now it's highlighted, providing us with the opportunity to rename it. I'm going to rename it now by calling it drone mesh. And now we have a second component in this actor attached to the default scene root. Now the drone mesh is a static mesh component. This is a type of component that can have a static mesh. In fact, with drone mesh selected in the details panel, we can see that it has a static mesh property, and this can be set to a specific static mesh. I can click the dropdown and I can search for drone, and I can choose my SM drone static mesh. And as soon as I select that, our drone mesh can now be seen here in the viewport. I can hold Alt and left click to rotate around it, and I can see that my actor now has a visual representation thanks to that drone mesh static mesh component. Now I'm going to go back to my basic map and notice that our BP drone, the instance of our BP drone actor blueprint, can now be seen in the world. And if I move it around, now we have something that we can actually see. I'm going to rotate it to face forward a bit, and I'm going to press play, and we can actually see that mesh in a Pi session. And that's because our actor now has a static mesh component. Let's hit stop and go back to our BP drone for a second. Now, we already know that every single actor has to have at least one component. And when you create a new actor blueprint, by default, we have the default scene root, which is a scene component. And we saw that we could not add a mesh to a scene component as the scene component type doesn't have that capability. We need a static mesh component if we want to add a static mesh to that component. But the static mesh component type also has the capability to be the root. We can actually replace that default scene root with our drone mesh. And doing that is as simple as clicking the drone mesh and dragging it on top of the default scene root. Now that default scene root component is gone, and our drone mesh has replaced it. It's now the drone mesh that is the root component for this actor. Now I'm going to hit Control Z to undo that, just to show you that our drone mesh is attached to the scene root, and that's why we can see a gizmo here that allows us to move that mesh relative to the default scene root. If we select the default scene root, there is no gizmo, and we can't move it because the root component represents the central point for the actor. Think of it as the origin point for the actor. The actor itself considers its own location to be the location of its root component. And as the root component moves, all attached components will move along with it. So if we go back to our basic map and we have our actor selected and we hit W, notice that the gizmo is right here at the root component. That static mesh component is off to the side, but it's attached. So if I move the root component, the static mesh is moving along with it. So if we wanted an offset from the actor's root like this, then we can use attachment and keep that default scene root and make our static mesh component attached to it, and then we can get that offset. But as soon as we drag that drone mesh onto default scene root to replace it as the root component, we now can no longer move that mesh here in the viewport for the blueprint editor because it's now the root. This is the official location for the actor itself. And going back to the basic map and clicking on the actor, we see that the gizmo is now at the center of that mesh because the mesh is the root component. So components are a powerful way to customize our actors because we can have multiple components in any given actor. If I select the drone mesh and click Add and add another static mesh component, we now have a second static mesh component. I'm not going to rename it. I'm just going to let it have the name static mesh, and I'm going to search for one of the meshes in my project. The asset pack that I downloaded earlier has a mushroom. I'm going to select this mushroom. Now it looks like my drone kind of has a mushroom growing out of the top of it. And I can even move that mushroom relative to the root component. As we can see in the basic map, there's our mushroom. And if I move my root component, the mushroom moves along with it because it's attached. So components support this idea of attachment, and they keep their relative offsets to one another. But only one of them can be the root component. Now, static mesh components aren't the only type of component we can add to an actor. There are lots of different kinds of components, and we'll learn about them as the course progresses. But for now, we know how to add components to actors to give them some sort of visual representation, and this is going to be done quite frequently as we develop our games. Now, I'm going to select the static mesh component, that mushroom, and I'm going to hit Delete to remove it. So deleting components is quite easy. So now that we know how to add components to actors, we're ready to dive deeper, and we'll do so in the next video. I'll see you soon.